You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I am really excited. I have an author coming on the show. Michelle Young has a new book called The Art Spy, and right off the bat, seeing that title, I was intrigued. But then to find out it is about a woman who contributed to the resistance in World War II. I mean, it was just like ticking all the boxes of my interests in art history. And so I am very excited to now get to learn from someone who has done so much more research than I have. Thank you so much for coming on, Michelle Young.
Thank you so much. This is really exciting.
Like I said, I'm very excited. I'm a modernist at heart. I geek out about so much stuff with World War II. I mean, it was a fascinating time. And before I get into any of that, though, I do want to make sure that I am plugging the pluggables. So listeners, if you are as nerdy and enthusiastic about a good art story based on true events, check out The Art Spy, which is coming out on May 13th, wherever you get your books, right? So I think I'm going to be publishing this just after it is on shelves. So go to the store right now, your favorite booksellers, pick up The Art Spy right now. Now, if I can, before we get into the story, of Rose Valland, am I correct?
Valland.
Valland. I can't
the
do
French
a French.
way.
I cannot do a French pronunciation. But before we get into her story, can you just sort of set the scene for us? Like, what was happening with arts? And I mean, obviously there was a war on, but can you tell us a little bit about what the scene was like that she was living in, that set up this compelling narrative to come?
Sure. So Rose was actually one of the most well-trained historians in France. She rose through the school ranks and ended up at both the École des Beaux-Arts, one of Paris's most famous art schools in Paris, as well as the École du Louvre, where she got another degree where she was training to be an art historian or curator, one of those kinds of fields. And as she entered the workforce in the 1930s, unpaid, which is one of the big plot points of the book, how long she was actually unpaid, she entered a world in which modernism, modern art was starting to flourish. So she worked at a museum called the Jeune, which was part of the French National Museums right next to the Louvre. But modern art was not really considered very prestigious or the pinnacle of someone's career trajectory. So she took this job really as a last resort because she couldn't get a job elsewhere. This was related to the fact that she was one of the few female curators out there. And there are some other factors related to a nemesis she had at the École du Louvre. And so, but you can still imagine that at the Jeune, they're putting on exhibitions of modern art from all different countries, all around the world, all over Europe. And it's really a who's who of who attends these exhibition openings. So you've got Picasso, you've got Braque, you've got really everyone, all the artists who are practicing in France and elsewhere come. And these exhibitions are a big deal and they're covered in all the newspapers. But at the same time, the regular art history practice is chugging along at the Louvre and they're preparing for war as well, just around the time my book starts. So they're figuring out how to pack up the art, how to protect it, and predict what might happen and how they can react to that.
And so that's interesting to me because I always think of the modern arts as being less respected, certainly from the German side. I mean, there was the famous Degenerate Art Show where all the modernist stuff was held up for ridicule publicly as a big propaganda effort. But I didn't realize that being a curator of modern work was less prestigious, even in France as well. Because I always think of France and Paris specifically as the center of the avant-garde at that time.
Yeah, and I think French society is really interesting in this way because there's really a division. There's the old guard, the traditional guard, and actually that guard still exists today. And
Certainly.
the old guard is the Louvre and some of the other museums in Paris, right? And it's looking at really like Renaissance, all the other periods. And then, of course, there is this really vibrant avant-garde scene that's happening, but they're on the fringe, right? Even though they're covered in the papers and such, in terms of getting a career in the arts, you want to work at the Louvre.
Yeah, which I mean makes sense. I feel like the old joke about like Picasso, you see his masterpieces when he was 15 and he was painting stuff that, looked stunning and representational. The Communion is what I'm thinking of. And then you look at his later work and it not only looks childish, but it looks almost, like a bad ripoff of Picasso, And so I always joked that it's like he kind of evolved in reverse with his career in modernism.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think a lot of the artists felt like they had to unlearn a lot of the stuff that they learned at schools like the École des Beaux-Arts, where it was very regimented and there was a certain way to do things. And really modernism was a reaction to that and the history of the evolution of representation alongside.
Yeah, and which I guess is why a number of people will point to that sort of time period as a time of like modernists de-skilling the art world. And certainly one person who was making that argument was Hitler himself, which I mean had to be a terrifying prospect. I think of people like Max Beckmann who were fleeing, and I mean we saw a lot of people fleeing Europe in that time period. Because being a modernist and being so anti-establishment and anti-tradition kind of puts you in a very uncomfortable position when you're seen as an enemy of the state in some extent. And then you had already a little bit alluded to people sort of prepping for and packing up and trying to preserve. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like from a curator's perspective? What specifically was the prep they were doing for all of their work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the French National Museums began preparing for another war in the early 1930s, basically when the Nazi Party became a majority. And they started to see echoes of what might come again to them. And they didn't want the same thing that happened to them in World War I, which is they didn't start moving art out of Paris until after the French borders were breached. So in the 30s, they started doing lots and lots of studies. The curators started to make lots and lots of lists. What's first priority to be moved out? What's second? What is art that can be protected on site and doesn't necessarily need to be moved? But they're also requesting packing materials, boxes, tape, everything you could think of, including first aid supplies, because those curators may need to stay in the museums if war breaks out or a bomb drops and they need to figure out how to shelter themselves and the artwork. So this takes the next 7 years, really 1932 to the outbreak of war. And this process gets repeated and they get to test it a few times even. So in the Munich Accords, they do one move and they learn from that. And then they finally begin the official move at the end of August as diplomatic discussions start to break down between Germany and the West.
Yeah. And, the threat was, there was Nazi plundering, but also obviously bombings and stuff that could do damage to a lot of that work. And the scale of this, I think, is something that is still hard for me to wrap my head around, even though I've read a lot about this. There are estimates that hundreds of thousands of works have gone missing during that time period, either from plundering essentially or damage from the war and all of that. I've read estimates as high as like 600,000 pieces of art going missing in that time period. And as maybe this is just like, you're a product of the culture that you grew up in. I have always heard about like the Monuments Men and stuff like that, but I think it's worth noting it was not just the Monuments Men. There were also women involved in there, and it was an effort of hundreds of people across a dozen or so countries to pack up and preserve and take care of all of these different works. And one of those active in the process was Rose Valland, the subject of The Art Spy. And can you tell us a little bit about how she came to become a part of the resistance?
Yes. So Rose packs up the art, and when the Germans arrive to Paris, she manages to escape and takes the leadership role in the museums in evacuating the art and the personnel. And then she comes back to Paris in July. She really insists. She didn't want to leave, and she insists on coming back. And a few months later, the Nazis requisition her museum. They request with the head of the National Museums, a man named Jacques Chauchard, if they can use, or they say they need more space. They're moving all the art that was originally looted by the German ambassador to France. He took it upon himself to start the looting, and they need more space. They want to take it over from him. It's a group under Alfred Rosenberg who comes into play, and they've decided they need more space. So they take over the Jeu de Paume with permission. And she had already been placed there. She's been working there for 8 years. And her boss was actually in the resistance, and he instructs her on October 31st, 1940, to stay at all costs in the Jeu de Paume Museum.
And that seems like a perfect note to end our first segment. We're going to leave you in a little bit of suspense, and after a short break, we're going to learn about exactly what she did to contribute to the resistance. Now, I am back talking to Michelle Young, author of The Art Spy. So you left off, the Nazis are taking over different areas, and her boss is a member of the resistance. Tell us, what did Rose do in that situation?
Yeah. So as you can imagine, that's a pretty broad directive. And she decides she's going to just start documenting what's happening. So it begins with an alleged duplicate inventory. The agreement is that the Germans can do their own inventory, but the French get a chance to also document what's coming in and out. This is extremely important because they already know that looted art is coming through. So she tries to document it, but she's shut down right away. And so she then has to use her almost perfect photographic memory to just look at stuff, remember stuff, and then she makes lots and lots of notes when she's back at home in her apartment. So this includes who's visiting, what paintings are coming from, which families, especially the Jewish families, have they been stolen from, where are they going? She notes down shipping labels. She also documents all the intrigue and infighting that's happening between all the Nazis and all the different levels of hierarchy and the people who are visiting. So that includes Hermann Göring, Alfred Rosenberg, a lot of art historians, and a lot of greedy people, middlemen who are French. Really, it's a rotating door of anyone interested in acquiring / stealing for no money some of the best art that's in France.
I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been to be in this space where you're trying to preserve these works and you're contributing to the resistance, but the enemy is constantly walking through your workspace and you have to smile and be polite and defer to them in everything.
Yeah, that's exactly the thoughts that I had. There's always a distinction that people somehow make between resistance operators that were in the field. And that means, they ran their own resistance network. They were out in the rest of France. But I think her job was equally, if not more dangerous, because like you said, every day she had to work with the Nazis. There were death threats that they put against her. They wanted to execute her. They interrogated and searched her rather brutally multiple times. They kicked her out multiple times. So, yeah, you have to think about the mindset of that type of person that's able to withstand this for 4 years. And I mean, I would not be able to do this for sure.
So they had suspicions about her. They didn't trust her and they interrogated her. How did she make it back from that?
Yeah. So the interrogations were usually part of thefts that were happening. And then the Germans were stealing and then they needed scapegoats. So then they would blame the French guards or her. And she was a very serious deadpan type of personality. And so when she was caught, she would just answer very directly. So one time she was caught scribbling down something, which she almost never did. And her nemesis in the museum, a Nazi named Bruno Loza, said, "You know what the consequences are for doing something like that. You could be shot." And she looked right back at him and said, "Everyone here knows the consequences of that. Like, basically, no one would ever take that risk." And so that was one way she did it. And another way was to really downplay her capabilities. They thought she was just some kind of secretary, which is how she was originally hired at the museum, that she was maybe more like a building superintendent. She knew the guards and she managed them. And aligned with this, she also mentioned that she deliberately made small mistakes that would sabotage their efforts. Not big enough that would get her fired, but small enough to make her seem a little incompetent. And she trained the other French guards in the museum to do similar things.
Okay, so she kind of used their biases against them. That is absolutely brilliant.
Yes. And she was an academic at heart and she looked the part. And so I'm sure they thought she was just some mousy secretary nerd. And she also mentioned that because, she was this part curator, part secretary, it was okay for her to wander around and seem to be checking things out. Like that imprudence was explainable, is what she said.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. That's interesting. So now as she's walking around and she's looking at things and pieces are going missing and she's documenting all of this, can you tell us a little bit more about well, I have so many questions. I want to start with one, maybe some of the interesting work that passed through that space. Do we have any notes on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So really the very first painting that was documented and that the Nazis were looking for was called The Astronomer by Vermeer. And this was important for many reasons, but one being that Hitler was obsessed with the old masters and Vermeer was one of the pinnacle artists. And this was owned by the Rothschilds, had been in their possession for a very long time. And the Nazis really wanted this painting. So if you look at the records, this is artwork number 1 that comes through. Then there's a lot of modern art that comes through.
That just reminds me of Han van Meegeren, who was passing off fake Vermeers to, I think it was Goring at that time, right? Was it actually a Vermeer that passed through there?
Yes, and it's actually really funny because Rose makes very extensive notes about Goring, and he visited no less than 20 times to the Jeu de Paume for shopping trips, of which he never paid for anything. And she notes that he really wanted to be seen as a connoisseur, but she writes that he was nothing of the sort, which I think would have really pissed him off. So yes, he would not have been able to tell the difference between real and fake. And he often relied on art experts to help him out and select.
And then I'm sorry, I cut you off interjecting there because I think you were going to start to talk about another piece. I just, when I feel like I have something to contribute to a conversation, I can't resist jumping in.
No, absolutely. There were a lot of modern art pieces that came through, and I won't talk about them in specifics, but the Nazis didn't know what to do with these because Hitler hated them. Goring followed Hitler's lead and didn't collect them. And so they stuffed them all into one room in this museum. So these are paintings by Picasso, Braque, Leger, Dali, every modern artist you can think of. They just piled them here, hung them floor to ceiling, put them on stands. And this becomes one of the most important things to Rose, how to save these paintings. And it really defines the rest of her life, actually, in many ways.
So would it spoil too much to ask? How did she save them?
Well, no, it doesn't spoil it. Actually, one of the episodes was turned into a Burt Lancaster movie in the 1960s and was optioned off of her memoir. This movie is called The Train. And one of the things she was intently focused on was how to save the remaining paintings in the Japon Museum that were mostly modern art paintings. So there were around 1,000 paintings, along with sculptures and other objects. And it becomes a real race against time. She knows that the Allies are coming, but these objects are on a train. And she works with the resistance to sabotage this train and prevent it from leaving France.
Oh, so how do you sabotage a train?
Oh, well, you work with train operators. And so they did things like mess up the signals, break down the engine, cause all these mechanical problems. And in a final move, they tried to disable some other vehicles so they would get in the way of this train leaving France. So very, very exciting stuff.
I mean, it sounds amazing. It sounds cool, but also like terrifying. I mean, it's like real life action hero type stuff as, you know, you're trying to figure out ways to break down a massive, powerful engine and vehicle, but also not get caught doing it. Right?
Right. And one of the men in the museum, his name is Kurt von Baer, and he's like a Nazi straight out of Central Casting with a glass eye and a jacket of wolf hair, a collar and all sorts of things. He is there on the last days before the liberation, pacing up and down the train platform, yelling and asking, why isn't this train moving? And she makes a note that at some point he returns back to his headquarters and he's guarded, heavily guarded, and she writes, too bad, dommage. And kind of what she had in mind is left unsaid, but it really does feel like she was hoping maybe the resistance or could go after him.
Oh, man.
And take him out.
That is an amazing story. And I cannot help but think about like just the strength and courage to be doing that in that situation. Like, I think we all like to pretend that we would do the same thing, but like, honestly, I don't know that I would have it in me to stare people down during such difficult and dangerous, extreme circumstances. It's absolutely amazing.
Right. And I think for me, my lack of poker face would do me in. You know, any question, I'd be like, ah. But she managed to keep her cool every time. And even after they kicked her out, she got back in. You know, they would kick her out for days at a time when like the war was going badly and there was too much suspicion around the museum. But then somehow she made her way back in each time and said she needed to be there.
Persistence pays off, I guess.
Yeah.
Persistence and courage, but absolutely amazing story. And I know, again, I want to, you know, be sure I'm shilling for you. So I will also point out to readers, there's so much more that is captured in the book than what we can capture in here. But after one last short break, I want to ask for a few more stories from you. Now, I do want to say I absolutely love learning about new figures. And I'm curious, like, this story is so compelling, but Rose Valland is not exactly a household name. I mean, you had to teach me how to pronounce it like 5 times in this episode, and I'm still not convinced I got it right. But first off, how did she become semi-lost to history, do you think?
Yeah, this is what really got me down this road. I discovered her in a book called Goring's Man in Paris by Jonathan Petropoulos, which is about one of the men that worked as Goring's agents and worked in the museum that Rose was in. And every time she appeared on the page, for me, she like jumped out. And I looked her up and realized that she was one of the most medaled women from World War II. And I thought, I read a lot of World War II books and I read a lot of especially female resistance World War II books. So the fact that I hadn't heard of her was shocking to me. And then again, why she's been forgotten. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One, she continued fighting for art restitution until she died. And this topic became very pesky for the French because there were too many famous names who had been involved in some way, had collaborated in some way or implicated. And people wanted to move on. It was the Cold War. So no one really wanted to talk about this, but she kept fighting for it and kept trying to get art back to their original owners. And she was an academic, as I mentioned. So her book is pretty dry, her memoir. And so I think all these factors together contributed to her being kind of left off the record. And she was a prickly person when she needed to be, which is how she survived the war, I think, in her role. And so it's not like the men in power in the art world, if they weren't her allies before or during the war, they weren't going to keep promoting her afterwards.
Yeah, and I mean, those last two feel like they sound a little bit related almost. I mean, a prickly person who, you kind of get that sense of justice that you hold on to, you can't let it go, that like these pieces were plundered, and she continued that fight to try to, I don't know what the word is, repatriate or send things back to the original owners and the families and the descendants. Am I right in that? Yeah.
The art term would be restitution, but you're absolutely correct. And I would also add that she was either loved or hated. So when I went through, the massive amount of documents in many different archives of her papers, you see this. You see people who call her a saint and are so indebted to her and like really praise the work she's doing. And then you know the opposite, and you do see some of those records too. And we know what happened to her reputation after the war. And so a person that had very binary reactions from people.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like that's a very polarizing time. I guess a lot of stuff happening there. You are either really against it or really on board with it. But so now I guess my question was going to be, what made her a compelling figure for you to want to write about? But I think we've already covered a bit of that. But I am curious, as you did all of this exhaustive research, I always wonder, what did you encounter that surprised you? Or what did you find that maybe you didn't know about at the start of this process?
Yeah. So part of your last question, I felt like I could make her story, her real story, as exciting as it should have been, as we see it now in the 21st century, looking back at this woman. I felt like it was the right time. And I'm someone that is very relentless and exhaustive in the research. And so two of the things that I was surprised by and was happy to uncover, one was her personal life. There hadn't been much known about her relationship with her lifelong partner, including even how they met or when they met. This woman was named Joyce Here. She worked for the U.S. Embassy, but she was of British origin, but also half German. And through the research, I was able to identify that they met really like in the late 1920s and started living together by 1936 or earlier. And so that means that during the war, they're living together. And this makes this whole story, I think, and the risk she took even greater, because not only is she in a relationship with a woman, which is codified in Vichy French law as, a natural act. But she is, Joyce, her partner, is also considered an enemy alien because she's British. So really, and then you add on to that her role in the museum spying, all of this together is so, so dangerous. And because Rose herself never really expressed her emotions, even in her book, there's just only a little bit of it. I had to really dig through all her drafts and her notes and her scribbles and what she wrote to other people to really put together any particular page of the book. I think understanding her personal life really gave a humanity to this woman who's usually just celebrated for like XYZ. These are the things she did. This is what she saved. But here is this kind of full-bodied person who has her faults, but is also amazing and has his personal life. And that I was really excited to discover. And then other things are correcting the record in some ways of things that are known about her. So she had talked about 500 paintings being burned by the Nazis in the courtyard of her museum. And for some reason, this was put into doubt, even though every other aspect of her records people find flawless. And I made it part of my job to figure out how to tell this part of the story. And in the end, I was able to find incontrovertible records that this actually took place. So, and she fought for the rest of her life trying to correct this record.
And I applaud you on that, because I think it's not only great when you have some interesting heroic acts, but I love when you bring the humanity to it, when we feel like we get to know who this person, this historical figure was as a person. I absolutely love that. And of course, I cannot resist a good spy story. I absolutely love it. Like, it's just, ever since I was a kid, I've loved that kind of stuff. The intrigue, the espionage, all of that going on in here. And this is an amazing story. I want to remind listeners, if I haven't mentioned it enough, the book is called The Art Spy. You can get it from your favorite bookseller or check the links in the show notes. But once again, I want to say a big thank you, Michelle Young. I really appreciate your taking the time to teach me about a figure that I honestly am ashamed to say I was ignorant about, but I appreciate learning more. So thank you.
I think almost everyone has not heard of her, and I'm really glad to bring her to life and hopefully give her the credit that she's due.
Thank you so much. Again, I really appreciate your taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.